Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome back to the conference. We're kicking off this afternoon with the philosophical perspectives on the theme of our conference. My name's James Orr, I'm the MacDonald Postdoctoral Fellow here, and it's my great pleasure and privilege to be introducing, first of all, Baroness Honora O'Neill of the University of Cambridge and former chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Baroness O'Neill, over to you.
I'm going to be very depressing. I'm going to comment briefly on two hypotheses about virtue and the university, and then follow up one of them in more detail. I think there are two quite separate reasons why the role of universities in fostering or teaching virtue may seem to be, and may actually be, diminished and elusive. It might be due to changes in contemporary universities, particularly perhaps in the UK. Alternatively, it might be due to changes in the way we think about virtue. Both hypotheses have a certain plausibility and they're fully compatible, but I think that the second hypothesis offers a more systematic account of why it is difficult to foster virtue in and beyond universities. I'm going to argue that the difficulties that universities have in fostering or nurturing virtue in their students or in other members of the university are largely due to wider limitations in contemporary accounts of ethics and in wider views about the implications of those accounts of ethics for virtues. The way we think about ethics, both of the public and of the non-public domain, both about justice and about virtue, have changed profoundly. However, let me say a little bit about changes in universities, which I think bear on the issue. I agree that contemporary universities, especially in the UK, are likely to provide unfavourable settings for cultivating the virtues. It's sometimes hard to work out whether virtue ethics has done better, whether it has provided us with a revaluation of values or devaluation of values. I will comment on that. But I think the answer may be that it's offered bits of one and bits of the other. But it's easier to say something about why universities are an uncongenial place for the cultivation of virtue. Universities have been subjected to regulatory and funding systems that use laborious, intrusive research and teaching metrics. The resulting demands for accountability are often time-consuming and distracting, and they may become more so with an increased emphasis on teaching metrics once the recently enacted Higher Education and Research Bill is implemented. So, not good. Detailed demands for accountability have, I think, altered the relations between academics and students. They diverted time and energies that perhaps used to be available for less structured activity and interaction, and which might have been important for the cultivation of virtue. They may have created strong and sometimes indeed perverse incentives for narrow conceptions of success as the main objective of university endeavour. The new demands typically emphasize comparative measures of success rather than excellence, and this, I take it, is likely to make it harder for the virtues to flourish. So much for familiar gloom with which we regale one another from time to time in the university sector. However, I don't think this is the main problem. I think that these changes in universities are themselves aspects of, or corollaries of, or reflections of wider and deeper social, cultural, and philosophical changes. Contemporary life, including university life, takes place in a culture in which ethics as a whole is often marginalized in ways that can be particularly damaging to thinking about or cultivating virtue. Damage to the cultural, intellectual, and philosophical underpinnings of ethics have, in my view, infected the ethics of both the public and the private domain and have marginalized virtue. Now, you're going to have to forgive me for some very sketchy intellectual history, because that was the only way I could think of getting, as it were, a large number of points arranged in any sort of coherent sequence. So let me talk about how ethics has been marginalised, despite the fact that we have unparalleled amounts of publication and discussion and mention in the media and mention by people at large. For over a century, ethical discussions in Western traditions have questioned and have quite often jettisoned much that had been central to European views of ethics. Philosophical discussions of ethical issues used to centre on responses to a classical question, namely, what ought we do, or what ought I do? It was an agent's question, and that was the important feature of it. The answers that were offered provided accounts of what ought to be done, but they differed about whether the focus should be mainly on virtues, or mainly on duties, or mainly on the consequences of action, or on all three connected together. Despite differences, many differences in views about ethical justification, I think there was wide agreement that a broad account of what ought to be done that would be relevant to the public and the non-public domains was important. And many discussions of ethics classically distinguished between the perfect, meaning simply complete, duties of justice, and the imperfect, that is incomplete, ethical duties that had no counterpart rights. And some of them thought of the latter as duties of virtue. It's a common phrase in the European tradition. Integrated accounts of the duties of justice and of virtue have therefore a very long history in our continent. They had been central for Cicero, for St. Thomas, for the early moderns, of course for Kant, but also for John Stuart Mill. I find people don't often read chapter 5 of utilitarianism, where Mill goes on at length about perfect and imperfect duties. Philosophers might disagree, therefore, about the justification of ethical claims, but accounts of duty and of virtue remain deeply entrenched in daily life, in the life of the church, in discussions of public affairs, in discussions of private life, and in literature. Think, for example, of Wordsworth's Ode to Duty. Two very serious accidents happened in the last century, and I call them accidents not because they're inexplicable, but because they are actually quite surprising. In the early to mid-20th century, the first came along, and it was, I think, a most unfortunate one in that it disrupted that view that there was a broad spectrum of ethical claims to be taken seriously, and that view that the agent perspective mattered. The first change, or if you will, accident, was cultural, and it arose from very understandable revulsion about the exaggerated emphasis given to limited conceptions of patriotic duty in the First World War. Claims that duty was preeminently shown in being ready to die and to kill for king and country, or for Kaiser and country, reached a pinnacle during the First War. And in the wake of that terrible war, revulsion not merely against patriotic duty, but against the very idea of duty became widespread, and it was manifest both in popular and in literary culture. Of course, there had been those who prophetically said this sort of thing long before the First War, particularly Nietzsche, who said, "What destroys a man more quickly than to work, think and feel without inner necessity, without any deep personal desire, without pleasure, as a mere automaton of duty?" I rather like that quote. But after the First World War, indeed during it, the war poets were very suspicious of duty. Ian Foster took this up. Many, many writers of the 20s and 30s took it up. Now, the second accident, and I think its effects were accidental, even if it wasn't, was the fault of the philosophers. And it took the form of wholesale rejection of ethics in all its versions by the Vienna School, the rejection of ethics by logical positivists, who, as you'll remember, sought to undermine not merely ethics, but also theology, metaphysics, and aesthetics, all of them to be dismissed as literally meaningless. Now, the arguments for that arresting conclusion were pretty minimal. They amounted mainly to an assertion that ethical claims were not empirically verifiable, which was hardly a novel or decisive consideration. Neither duties of justice nor other ethical duties were left intact. But what might have been no more than an obscure episode in the history of philosophy gained surprisingly wide international influence when logical positivism spread after so many of its exponents were driven into exile, driven away principally from Vienna and Berlin, and thereby secured major influence across the universities of the world. So we could argue whether that's an accident, but it was something one could hardly have foreseen. What's happened since? Well, all too soon, the realities of another world war revealed some of the costs of undermining ethics in this very radical way, and a repair job was seemingly needed and was undertaken. But it was unfortunately a pretty limited repair job. Claims about human rights, rather than about duties, let alone about virtues, formed the core of a new consensus about the ethics of the public domain. And of course, that consensus is still very widespread, and there are people who are working very hard on sustaining it, perhaps not entirely wrongly. However, the advocates of human rights were very reticent about justification. Typically, they would appeal to arguments from authority, for example, state authority, the authority of the state's party in ratifying the human rights documents, that sort of thing. And they supported some, but only some of the claims about what ought to be done that had formerly been central to ethics. And I think that evasiveness about justification is still a very major issue in our public culture. So let me say a little bit about what I think theories of rights leave out. Accounts of human rights do not address, let alone answer, the classical question, what ought we do, or what ought I do? Instead, they try to answer the less savoury question, what ought we, or I, receive from others? That's what a right is. It's a claim. You get it from others. And this is seen as central to an account of the ethics, at least of the public domain, so of justice. Consequently, the proponents of human rights are largely silent about duties without counterpart rights. Whether they have a coherent position in so being is another matter. And they don't, in fact, say much about the full range of issues that have usually grouped under justice, because they wouldn't, for example, say much about just distribution. But they are also silent, to a large degree, about who should shoulder the duties that correspond to those rights that require action that has to be assigned to identifiable agents rather than to everybody. So a right to freedom of speech, that's easy, because everybody's going to have to not silence other people if there's a right to freedom of speech. But, for example, the well-known right to food and the equally well-known right to health, which might perhaps better have been called the right to health care, food and health care, you have to have the particular farmer or the particular physician to deliver it. Theories of rights simply offer a very incomplete accounts of the corresponding duties, and they say nothing about the rest of ethics, the traditional imperfect duties and the traditional virtues. You may say that the first of these problems was remedied to some degree in the 1960s with the various covenants, human rights covenants, which were introduced in order to tie the duties down. But I'm afraid when you read them closely, they don't tie the duties that are the counterparts to human rights claims down. They tie down second-order duties to ensure that there is somebody who carries the duties that correspond to human rights claims, and that second-order duty is assigned to the state's party, but, of course, the action has to be done by whomever they assign. So we're left with a very, very incomplete and sketchy view of who ought to do what for whom. The human rights proponents have also had, and this is understandable, pretty little to say about ethical justification, often just arguments from authority, increasingly, in my view, leaning on versions of legal positivism rather than logical positivism, which again is very understandable. But I would submit that positivist arguments of either sort are inevitably justification light. Now, I can't do this without saying a little bit about another post-war movement, which was the so-called death of political philosophy. During the early years of the human rights movement, it's interesting that it was at that time, wider discussion of the justification of principles of justice or duties of justice were very often neglected. And that slogan, political philosophy is dead, gained a lot of traction in the 40s and 50s, Peter Laslett and Holton and many others. It was only with the re-emergence of serious work in political philosophy during the 1960s and since that attempts to offer a more systematic justification of duties of justice was renewed. However, this revival also took a pretty selective and increasingly selective view of ethical requirements. So, for example, in his early and very well-known work, A Theory of Justice, John Rawls, my supervisor, allowed for ethical duties as well as duties of justice. But in his later work, in particular in his equally well-known Political Liberalism, he explicitly sets aside claims that go beyond questions of justice, so was silent about wider ethical claims and about virtue. That is the meaning of that very odd label, political liberalism. Most of us would have thought, well, liberalism is obviously a political philosophy, but it was introduced with a new and narrower meaning in Rawls' later work. So human rights approaches and the newly revived political philosophy were united in ignoring duties other than duties of justice, and then the duties of justice that so to speak, corresponded to the rights of individuals. Now, one might say, well, at least there were some other contenders because there's virtue ethics. Discussions that go beyond questions about justice were picked up by a range of quite disparate approaches that we speak of as forms of virtue ethics. They took differing approaches to ethical life and typically said very, very little about justice. Evidently, the more Aristotelian end of the debate has aimed to anchor accounts of virtues in substantive accounts of the good for man. This is metaphysically very demanding. I do not know that it can be done, but if it can be done, it satisfies the requirement. But that's not the mainstream of virtue ethics. Virtue ethics really is a chaotic group of varying streams. There is, of course, communitarian virtue ethics. Quite a lot of proponents of virtue ethics want to anchor specific virtues or a specific account of the virtues in the traditions, standards, and beliefs of actual social groups and communities. This approach, of course, leaves it unclear what justifications can be offered to outsiders, and whether the justifications purportedly offered to insiders will have adequate weight. This, I think, matters for ethical as well as philosophical reasons. Some cultures and some subcultures are wedded to traditions that others see as narrow, prejudiced, cruel, corrupt, or defective in other really major ways. It's simply not clear how far communitarian justification can reach. And in my view, justification from within can't reach far enough. There have, of course, been many attempts to, as it were, modify that conclusion or to soften it by thinking about, usually by historicizing communitarianism and saying, oh, well, we can think about the development of the tradition. Why it's supposed always to go in a good direction is not entirely clear. There have also been people, actually quite a lot of them, who have thought, no, that's completely the wrong way to go. What you want to do is to understand that virtues are supererogatory. They are beyond duty, beyond what is asked. For example, Alan Gaworth and John O'Connor both characterize philanthropy as supererogatory. This thought may be plausible or not, I'm not sure that it is, but it certainly presupposes an account of duty, namely the very thing that is lacking. If you haven't got a theory of duty in place, you could hardly start talking about the supererogatory. And in any case, I don't think it's at all clear that the full range of virtues should be thought of as supererogatory. It was, after all, conventional to think of them as matters of imperfect, incomplete duty to which others did not have entitlements, but duties nonetheless and required of agents. But I think today far the most popular view of virtue is that it's a matter of individual commitment. And that when we think about what used to be accounted virtuous action, we would see it as individual commitment, or a very favoured phrase, as reflecting individuals' values. Say it with piety. On such views, values are seen as subjective and not required. And it then makes sense to speak of, and this is part of common parlance now, my virtues, my values, his values, our values. But it's completely unclear whether these things which are claimed to be values are susceptible of justification. For quite a lot of social scientists, and you will recognize the footprints of libertarian theories in economics here, preferences, the happenstantial preferences of individuals or decisions of institutions are spoken of as their values. It's quite a big promotion, isn't it? This sleight of hand makes it very hard to work out whether virtue ethics has provided us with a revaluation of values, or possibly just with a devaluation of values. Perhaps it's offered a weird mixture of the two. Now, few are so bold as to claim that their central value, or the central value of their institution, their country, or their tradition, is, for example, self-enrichment, or doing others down, even where this is exactly what they prefer and what they seek. It may be understandable that people want to hang on to the idea that values are valuable, but they then undermine it by saying, oh, but they are subjective, they are a matter of choice, they're individual values. And the thought that justifications cannot support ethical standards fits pretty well with certain liberal ideals, not with all, but, and indeed not with classical liberalism, but with contemporary libertarianism probably adequately. It supports the thought that liberal conceptions of justice are all in the business of protecting individual choice and preference. Why is not said, but because there's no argument to show that what people subjectively prefer, what they value, is indeed valuable. But this can hardly be the whole story. Nobody thinks it doesn't matter what individuals choose. But if deeper justifications support only an account of justice, typically now formulated as an account of human rights, the only choices their proponents will be able to find reason to criticize, sanction, or forbid will seemingly be those that actually breach a requirement of justice by violating somebody's rights. That is, of course, a conclusion much treasured by libertarian liberals. Doing wrong is a matter of violating somebody's rights. I don't know where else one could get that conclusion from. So it seems to me highly implausible to think that a convincing account of justice can be indifferent to everything that doesn't violate somebody's right, or that appeals to preferences can justify rights. Much more is at stake, and some choices are more valuable than others. Now, this issue is now, I think, very difficult to get people to agree to, because it has been obscured by the promiscuous use of the term value to refer to whatever individuals happen to choose or prefer, leaving it fatally obscure what is at stake. Indeed, whether it is empirical claims, these are the things people prefer, or normative claims, these are the things that it is good to prefer. And that, I think, is just very problematic. There will be no general reason to see anything, let alone everything, that individuals choose or prefer as valuable in this world, and much that is chosen or preferred may be worthless or bad. Some individuals choose self-enrichment or sadistic treatment of others, but this doesn't show that self-enrichment and sadism are values in a sense that connects in any way with the history of moral philosophy, or indeed with the history of theology, or indeed, I think, with European history of what people actually have thought. And the fact that some people choose or pursue these preferences doesn't somehow metamorphose them into values. So I think the best first step we could take is to stop using the term value for what we have just pigeonholed as subjective, and to try and think about normative claims more seriously. My conclusion is that it's probably true that universities are not fostering the virtues, but that conclusion is overdetermined. It reflects both something pretty bad that's happened to the virtues and something not so nice that has happened to universities. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Baroness O'Neill, for a set of extremely incisive, if sobering, remarks. Questions and... we're going straight on to Professor Small of the University of Oxford. Welcome. Over to you.
Thank you first to Nigel, to Michael and to Claire for this kind invitation. And I have to thank Nigel especially because he has achieved what he and I both decided in the past was not a good idea, which is a conference program in which a talk by Small is followed by one by Bigger. Right. Did you do that deliberately? No. It's just waiting to happen. Okay. You'll have to forgive me. I am speaking about virtue, but I would like to speak about the way in which the structures of the work that are pursued in the university create situations in which certain kinds of virtue may or may not be being pursued. So it's a slightly more structural view. And it's not a view from philosophy, I should say. I'm not a philosopher, though I try to encroach. And I'm grateful to the very many philosophers who've been kind and assisted my attempts to encroach. But I'm going to speak today more from the background of someone who's tried to write about the ways in which advocacy for the humanities might be better pursued than it often is. Cinematic portrayals of the university, I'm not the first to observe, can be a good gauge of the public valuation of the humanities at any given point in time. A striking pair of American movies in 2008, Smart People and The Visitor, led one critic to observe a cultural shift away from a trope that had dominated the college movie genre in the late 1990s to the mid-2000s. That is, the middle-aged male English professor and failed writer who sleeps with his students, neglects his wife, and bullies his children. The 2008 films were different enough, Bruce Robbins observed, to look like a deliberate refutation. Again, says Robbins, the professor is crabby, misanthropic, affectively stunted, but this time he has an excuse. In both films, the professor is acting the way he is because his wife has died, and he's in mourning for her. My speculation, he went on, is that the dead wives are Hollywood's figure for the subject matter of the humanities. That is, they're a figure for art and ideas that in the public's eyes are genuinely beautiful and worthy to be adored as we academic humanists adore them, but they are also lost forever. By this theory, Hollywood would supply the deadwood professors with dead wives in a surprisingly good faith attempt to penetrate the mystery of what it is that humanists do, and the answer would be the remembering of beloved but now distant things. With 2014's thinner revisitation of the genre, The Rewrite is Any Gauge, We've Moved On Again. The teaching culture of the humanities has found itself a new representative. A middle-aged, crabby, misanthropic, affectively stunted guy, now divorced and out of contact with his kid, convinced that teaching the humanities is a charade. Jammy money if anyone's mad enough to pay you to do it and give you access to attractive female students. He's appalled to discover that he's expected to work and to act like a professional. What he has to teach his students, he will eventually discover, is that in creative writing, now put forward as the representative discipline of the humanities, rather than classics or literature, there are no rules, no required virtues, and no obvious content beyond what the students bring to the classroom. The humanities, it would seem, are even now the part of the higher education profession that puts pressure back against the dominant work ethic, against professionalism as a means of formalizing virtue, and against the assumption that anyone owes the world their living. They are the anti-disciplinary disciplines. If this sounds like a critique, it may be once again a good faith attempt on the part of Hollywood also to penetrate a mystery, entirely consistent with a long history of thinking about the humanities as the place that does critique. This is advocacy with a modern twist, since what's primarily defended is no longer a content for the humanities, the beautiful missing wife, as it were, but a semi-renegade comportment of the humanities teacher within the institution. He's still justifiably attractive. The wife was divorced long ago, and whether or not she's beautiful is unascertainable because she's out of the picture and apparently not much missed. The new love interest is a single mother holding down two jobs and studying creative writing in combination with psych. You need a handle on your sanity if you're committing to a humanities degree. Not irrelevantly, his place in the creative writing department puts the professor at the edge of the humanities division, even as he is its representative. He teaches the students who are idealistic or naive enough to hope that their university careers will lead directly into work that will be both artistically rewarding and remunerative. He will prove himself only really attractive to them and to everyone else if he gets his act together just enough for the institution to be willing to keep him on board, as of course he does. But the humanities have a second and, as it were, alternative representative in the rewrite. Forgive me spending so much time on this movie. There are, in fact, many, many movies that fit this bill. Woody Allen was another immediate possibility here, but I've gone with the rewrite, bad as it is. So the alternative representative of the humanities in this film is the professor's boss, the Jane Austen scholar, who, in his unreformed view, has sold out and become an institutional functionary, head of the ethics committee. It's not irrelevant that she's played by Alison Janney, better known as the White House press secretary in The West Wing. She's the disciplined critic who will need placating if her more renegade colleague is to find a space in which to do anything the general public might still find at once respectable and desirable in the role of a humanities professor as teacher. The ideal humanities department, it would seem, allows for both. The professional overseer of ethics who does Austenian irony at the top, the pre- or anti-professional teacher who prefers clueless to Austen straight, giving her a disciplinary job to do. I start here because I thought you might need a laugh after lunch and a long day as well, but also because it's a quick way into a subject that increasingly seems to me at the nub of the difficulty the humanities often experience in advocating to the world beyond the academy for their diminishingly large economic role, but their persistently important cultural role within the university and within wider public debates about its purpose and value and virtues, namely the description we humanities academics and students give to our daily work. Not just advocates for the humanities, but ordinary practitioners of humanistic teaching and research are, in my experience, and I think this chimes with what Honora was just saying, surprisingly quick to move away from accounting for what we actually do and the various levels at which we do it, in favour of statements about value and claims about virtue, statements that have too often been defensively overblown, I argued, in The Value of the Humanities. There's a history to this manoeuvre away from work towards higher order claims, a part of which I want to put before you today. It has something to do with the special nature of the labour humanists undertake, sitting around reading, talking and writing about books and other expressions of culture all day. But quite a lot to do also with the ways in which the modern university has historically made a case for its public and its philanthropic funding. In a capricious essay of 1935 in Praise of Idleness, Bertrand Russell argued that one of the aims of modern civilization should be to release as many people as possible from the burden of alienated labour and afford them the benefits of what he called a wise use of leisure. And Praise of Idleness is speculative, rhetorical, and conscious of, perhaps embarrassed by, the mismatch between its author's career and the prospects of younger generations. The essay occupies a minor place, you might call it a prominent niche, in a long line of writing, predominantly but not exclusively from the political left or the liberal left end of the political spectrum, that has challenged the rightness of the dominant work ethic. In its 20th century forms, that line of thinking runs from Keynes's Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren through Clive Jenkins and Barry Sherman's The Collapse of Work, Andre Gortz's Farewell to the Working Class, and Jeremy Rifkin's The End of Work, to Tim Jackson's Prosperity Without Growth, and Kate Soper's recent series of journalistic essays, which I think she must have abandoned as a larger project, outlining how humanities departments might assist an alternative hedonism, a shift to a more materially reproductive way of living, a low or no growth economic model rooted in an expansion of leisure time and rather different conceptions of social flourishing and human well-being. Not the smallest hazard of a defence of idleness issuing still occasionally from the academy is that in theorising the value and the virtue of unalienated labour to non-academic publics, the philosopher critic will seem primarily to be justifying his or her own privileged position as an employee of the state whose work may appear to others and perhaps also to him or herself suspiciously like pleasure. For the Americans in the audience, I should say not just the employee of the state, though that will sometimes be it, but the employee of the state or the funded institution for which funding is accountable, to which it's accountable. Orwell's rentier intellectuals cast a long shadow here, enjoying freedoms made possible by money that they have not directly earned. All too often, Orwell said, convicted of a too Olympian attitude, a too great readiness to wash their hands of the immediate practical problem. Those Orwellian phrases written in 1940-41 are anticipated in the final pages of Russell's essay, Privileged Class Background, in both cases perhaps sharpening the political antennae for this subject. Having made a case for decreasing the quantity of mechanical or procedural work done and improving the kinds and quality of our leisure, Russell ruminates on the as yet very partially democratized condition of the intelligentsia. He writes, in the past there was a small leisure class and a larger working class. The leisure class enjoyed advantages for which there was no basis in social justice. This necessarily made it oppressive, limited its sympathies, and caused it to invent theories to justify its privileges. These facts greatly diminished its excellence, but in spite of this, it contributed nearly the whole of what we call civilization. It cultivated the arts and discovered the sciences. It wrote the books. A defence of the leisured class's existence by way of its cultural productivity must be an inadequate justification, Russell reflects, given how extraordinarily wasteful the model proved. As he puts it, one Darwin for every tens of thousands of country gentlemen who never thought of anything more intelligent than fox hunting and punishing poachers. By 1935, in contrast, the universities were supposed to provide, in a more systematic way, what the leisure class provided accidentally and as a byproduct. The most pressing modern problems for the university, as Russell saw them, were first that enlarged access to the privileged conditions of academic labour hadn't of itself done much to close the gap between the occupations and problems of ordinary men and women and the occupations of the few who earn a salary for intellectual labour. In other words, democratisation of access to the university hadn't ushered in a more populist conception of the proper objects of study. Russell presumably considered this not a major problem, though he doesn't explicitly say so. In other words, I can't see him as a kind of proto-Raymond Williams or Stuart Hall. Secondly, the academic institutions of the 1930s were, in Russell's view, too utilitarian, too instrumental in their conceptions of teaching and research for really original minds to flourish in them. The benefits of intellectual freedom had not, in that respect, kept pace with advances in social justice, though whether Russell was diagnosing a fault of institutional systems or making a vaguer complaint about the dearth of originality at all levels of society isn't entirely clear. The serio-comic air of In Praise of Idleness has led at least one recent critic to identify it as a modern exercise in cynic provocation, challenging the normative assumption that work is a necessity but ducking the next step of proposing a serious political program for social reform. Cynicism on this reading would be doing what cynicism has always done philosophically, debasing the moral currency, in this case the conventional currency of labour, but also, and perhaps more provokingly to advocates for the modern university, debasing the moral currency of intellectual freedom with the observation that most of what it gives rise to doesn't justify, though it may warrant, the special privileges required to produce it. I start with Russell, historic though he certainly is, and politically evasive though he seems to me, because he is a salient reminder that if some of our current concerns about instrumentalisation of higher education belong to the last 10 years of government policy making, more than that, 20-30, in many quarters of the globe, others do not. They stem from a much longer standing perception going back well beyond Russell to Adam Smith and indeed earlier, of a mismatch between the work of the university, especially but by no means only or exclusively the work of the humanities and the kinds of training required to service the wider economy. That mismatch is most often expressed as a criticism of educational curricula, but it's also, and importantly, a mismatch in the quality and the conditions of labour inside and beyond the university. Universities today are on both sides of the Atlantic, and I quote the last UK Minister for Universities and Science, David Willett's, big businesses. Those businesses are set within modern economic and governance cultures where they can no longer rely, I'm quoting him again, upon naturalistic arguments for their defence, but have to be able to mount rational claims and point to evidence, hard and soft, quantitative and qualitative, of the benefits they provide in return from public investment, including enhanced employability, from whence, as Honora was saying, many of our current woes flow. I was in fact interested to hear David Willetts on the radio last week saying that he thought we'd passed a tipping point in that culture and that we've made a mistake, or the we in this case being politicians generally and indeed administrators of public policy, have made an error in thinking that the right answer to justification is to provide more and more evidence, just a barrage of evidence. And I unfortunately had to go around a complicated roundabout at this precise point in his answer, but I think what he said at that point was something with more guts, compassion, feeling, and just conviction, and it needs to be said at that point, rather than the barrage of evidence that clearly is not doing the work it's supposed to do. Research or higher scholarship is almost by definition... sorry, I've missed a point here, let me go back. In several respects, it seems to me oddly easier to show the social benefit achieved by the university at the level of research than it is at the level of teaching. Research or higher scholarship is almost by definition seeking to preserve and extend understanding of the subject and the practice of interpretation at the highest level. This is not true at the undergraduate level. Unless we are describing the applied elements of law, medicine, veterinary science, engineering, some other instances of that kind, much of the subject content on which university study concentrates the attention of undergraduate and graduate students for 3 or 4 years at a stretch is a subject-specific mid-level training, higher than secondary school, but not at the cutting edge of what's known or speculated about. In the case of the humanities, it's training for the most part unlikely to be directly pertinent to the student's future employment. It's only recently that universities have started tracking the data on what actually happens to our students once they leave the university. I'm not going to go into that today. I'm sure you've all seen it, paid attention to it at certain points. Though I do want to say that I think the employment data matter more than some of my colleagues or others interested in advocacy think. If we don't control the data, it seems to me, we won't really understand what the effects are of what we're doing and what value or virtue it has as a preparation for students for the world beyond the university in the particular ways that advocacy now seems to does require, I think. And I also think not knowing the data is something we can't afford to do politically. So I'm quite interested in people like Andrew McGettigan in this culture who've taken on that job of trying to get the data, though that's not their, if you like, their subject base. Even as we get the fuller information on actual employment outcomes over several years, we remain in need of better accounts of how a humanities education is or isn't preparing students for other kinds of work. Delivering transferable skills via the subject is, after all, palpably inefficient. J.M. Coetzee puts the objection tersely. Do students really need to know about Hesiod and Petrarch, about Francis Bacon and Jean-Paul Sartre, about the Boxer Rebellion and the 30 Years' War to attain a sufficient competence in critical literacy? Why not jettison the discipline-specific content and teach targeted classes in literacy and business awareness and so forth? And as UK foundation degrees have been doing rather recently, more recently than your American liberal arts courses. It may be awareness of this palpable inefficiency coupled with a tendency not to distinguish questions about the value of research funding from questions about the value of teaching that's led so many defenders of the humanities to make very high-pitched claims for the education we give, as though every student were the ideal student and a pattern of intellectual virtue. Some of the skills humanities teachers look to impart, especially in the final year of a degree program, do indeed evolve a higher order, a conceptual, analytic, and expressive facility, but many are relatively and importantly rudimentary. They have to do more with the completion of training begun but very imperfectly accomplished by the end of secondary education, and that even the higher level work has to keep reminding itself matters. Not least they have to do with the installation of a work ethic. As I argued in the Value of the Humanities, pitching advocacy for humanities departments exclusively on the basis that we nurture higher level skills of intellectual critique underestimates the very substantial and important component of what we do that is, to put it more robustly, remedial, about achieving a sufficient, not an exceptional competence, and even more basic than that, about getting the students into the classroom and getting them to do some work that can genuinely count as work, as labour intensive. Am I sounding depressing? I didn't mean to sound depressing. Okay. It's about assisting the development of literacy, comprehension, accurate acquisition of information, the ability to fill it out and correctly summarize the most germane points before one starts on finer interpretation. It's also about dealing day after day with students who are not yet grown-ups in most cases, many of whom are fragile, or more worrying to me, very ready to accept invitations to think of themselves as fragile and in need of special institutional protections. Take a real student, though not, of course, one I'm going to name, and I hope I've concealed the identity thoroughly enough for you not to be able to identify this person approximately 100 yards away, I'd have thought at the moment. At the end of last term, I sat in an academic review, so that's Oxford speak for you. That means the master, the senior tutor, who is the academic director of the subject in the college, both subject fellows, so in this case both English dons, and the student, all in gowns. We keep the props of authority in Oxford. Enter, let's call him Felix. Felix has been in and out of the senior tutor's office for disciplinary and welfare reasons all term. I have pretty much exhausted my powers of direct and emailed encouragement, threat, and only when both fail, dogged proceduralism in trying to get him to honour the timetable of expectations on him. Felix is clever. His reports are read, they are good as to content, not very good as to the ability to turn in his more often than not first-class work on time or at all. The tutors finish. Well, Felix, says the master, what is your own assessment of your progress? And this is verbatim, I really do remember this sentence correctly, I'm sure. Well, master, replies Felix cheerfully, the trouble is that my innate perfectionism struggles with my would-be pragmatism. He then goes on to wax eloquent on the interesting subject of his own character, exceeding by some 17 minutes the 3 minutes allotted for this in the academic review programme. There is something of Felix in all of us as academics, though I hope not his attraction to long forms of self-expression in contexts where succinctness is a virtue. I look at my watch carefully. We are all well practised, as we've heard already today, at tying our descriptions of virtue to the perfectionist part of our educationally assisted characters. One of the things we do in all our disciplines is to cultivate an ethos of working at things until we get them right, revising, reworking, seeking and accepting criticism. This is part of what professionalism at its best nurtures. Too often, I think, what professionalism, when it becomes proceduralism, quashes. And not only, of course, in the university. I don't think it's irrelevant that it makes us quite good that we're able to look quite good that we're able to say this of it. But we might helpfully, I think, do more with the would-be pragmatism part in my students' wording. We produce the best we can think and say, given the extent to which our abilities and our knowledge have reached, given the extent that they've reached, and we do it against the clock, not just our own clocks, but those of others, students, collaborators, colleagues, funding bodies, and with one hopes a long arm, governments. We inhabit a culture that is a public culture that seems to me very unforgiving of mistakes. Doing one's institutional best under very constrained circumstances, allowing for mistakes, correcting them, and creating the spaces in which one can hope to do better with a little more time at one's disposal than many places of work still allow or now allow, is one of the things we can claim for the university as a space that still cultivates virtue. So this is the ground on which I want to propose we might be setting out any claims of virtue that we make for ourselves as humanities academics today. And it's no loss to us, it seems to me, that the virtues we can point to are virtues we would expect to be cultivated in most, but not all workplaces where judgment and knowledge is at the core of labour, the labour undertaken. Two ways in which our conversations about the future of universities generally and departments of humanities specifically might be improved, I think, are by first admitting that remedial and very constrained work is a crucial part of what we do, so allowing for a thicker, more truthful description of our ethical practices in the course of everyday teaching and research. And B, factoring in a wider variety in the mission of universities. I'm not going to go into this because you all know it, but there's a lovely description from Clay Shirky, if anybody wants to pursue it, in an article called Your Massively Open Offline College is Broken. I think the fact that advocacy for the university is, in the first place, often pitched at the ideal university, still in the kind of analogy that we were given first thing this morning, in those kinds of high-level description of what we do, and that it imagines the university as a kind of would-be ideal institution too. There's a huge problem. Why we don't have more advocates coming from the more beleaguered colleges and universities in our system, I don't really understand. When I ask the friends I know who teach in such institutions why, their simple answer is we never get asked to speak. And that is, I think, a huge problem because they're doing really virtuous work, more virtuous than my struggles with Felix in many ways, and it would be good to have it spoken of. So raising or trying to raise the level of literacy and cogency for the 90% of students and colleagues, I think, not represented in most of our conversations about the work of the humanities and for whom there's not and probably never can be the resource available to bring that work to a level most of us would deem satisfactory, is not a small contribution to a society. Framing a dislocation in the perception of work around the question of fitness of educational content to future employment purposes puts the focus on the undergraduate's supposed rationale for entering higher education. Framing the dislocation around the status of the academic's intellectual labour tends to put the focus on academic freedom, understood as a necessary condition for higher learning. Think about either the students or the academics' work from the perspective of the university's policymakers, and the questions may look rather different again. The fitness or otherwise of educational content to future employment purposes is a question that requires the university to consider its duties to the student. What do we think students go to university for, or ought to go to university for? Do we have reason to believe that we are enhancing their employability? Should we be trying to do better in that regard, or do other criteria have priority? Framing the question of work as one of the academic's intellectual labour, by contrast, requires the university to find the right line between how it responds to new pressures from without and how it protects the authority of professional educators and scholars to decide the content and delivery of the subject matter in which they, not the administration, have expertise. These perspectives are, to put it mildly, not perfectly congruent, but the potential for friction isn't new, and if it seems new, then reading Russell as one way of recognising it is a very long-standing, and I would argue a structural fact, that university teaching and research depends upon conditions and perceptions of labour and employment that are to a degree unlike those that obtain in other fields of work. Is not, this is a rhetorical question, is not the resistance of the institutionalised critic faced with the pressure to deliver a more efficient workplace-targeted education, in part the embarrassment of a class of workers who have historically known themselves to be occupying positions of privilege? Those privileges are imperfectly democratised, even now, and many would want to say that they are greatly diminished privileges of late. Still, the university has been sufficiently institutionally protected and sufficiently far from the old aristocratic model of cultural production to have allowed academics to cast themselves for much of the last century as representatives and defenders of the state's obligation to foster the common good. To put pressure on academics to deliver employability skills is to remind them sharply that they continue to enjoy a direct relationship between the knowledge content and the social function of their work in the provision of teaching materials or contributions to scholarship that will be experienced only by that tiny percentage of students who themselves go on to careers in academia or who use the knowledge they've acquired in the culture industry and wider educational sectors, film, fiction, curatorial work, educational writings, and so forth. It's also to remind them, that means us, the academics, that unless something has gone badly wrong, our work will be interesting to us, as not all work beyond the academy is, even when it requires a high level of education in its employees. Only we can produce the detailed justification of the content of our work and the conditions of its production that can justify continuity of those protections. The priorities of academics pursuing their profession are, in short, not seamlessly at one with the priorities of students attending university, and also not seamlessly at one, of course, with university management. Deciding how far they can and should be aligned is an intellectual and a political problem. One better consequence of the re-incentivisation of teaching under the current fees regime in the UK, much as most of us resisted it and still resist it, has been the parallel debate opening up in the US about differential labour conditions of tenured and non-tenured faculty, is an increasingly widespread acknowledgement of the extent to which the funding of research and the profession's concentration on research as the primary criterion for career advancement has tended to devalue teaching in recent years. I will wrap up. If Bertrand Russell's recipe for social reform by way of an increase in idleness looks not just capricious but outmodedly utopian now, it is in part because he, like Keynes, understandably failed to predict the main changes in the economy affecting the labour market and higher education over the second half of the 20th century. The old distinction between alienated and unalienated labour, as Russell put it, altering the position of matter at or near the Earth's surface and telling other people to do it, is undoubtedly less pertinent to the conditions of work in today's globalised economy than it was to national labour conditions in Britain in 1930, though it remains a political issue. It's less likely, as I've already acknowledged, to resonate well with university workers who, on average, probably feel and are more alienated from their employment than the generation now entering retirement. But the terrain for comparison with other privileged lives has also altered. And this is where I'll finish. A more telling counterpart to the university worker today than the leisured rentier would be the financial sector worker increasingly asked to support him or her through business-university collaborations or philanthropic donations that go well beyond the obligations of taxation. If David Lodge were preparing to write nice work in 2017, he might well feel some pressure to turn his industrial hero, Vic Wilcox, into an asset manager, a move that would all but scupper the viability of the Gaskellian, that's Elizabeth Gaskell, narrative underpinning, with its deep moral attentiveness to the relationship between masters and men. Though it would open up to me some very interesting areas of alternative moral inquiry. An up-to-date example of the university novel genre, for example, would have to pay attention to the shifting nature of the relationship between state-funded work and work that's partly or largely sustained by private investment. And it would have to answer some rather different political questions about who generates the wealth of a society and how. The wealth gap between modern financial elites and the ordinary citizen elite rightly provokes public outrage, but no critique of that inequality can afford to claim that the 1% or the 0.1% or 0.01%, depending which fraction you're most aggrieved about, do not work. Yet neither recent literary fiction nor film nor recent advocacy for the humanities is as yet rich in descriptions of financial work that might help us conceive of that recasting of the terrain of labour in ways that go beyond conceiving of the university as a last outpost of aristocratic privilege. The favoured figure of the 20th century academic novel and film, the scandalous Don, continuing in the employment of quasi-seigneurial privileges until his abuse or negligence, usually sexual abuse, becomes so glaring that the institution is compelled to act, suddenly looks, as the rewrite for all its weaknesses recognises, rather passé. As Bruce Robbins points out, the 20th century academic novel favoured for a surprisingly long time the sceptical but in its final tendency conservative point of view of the college retainer, who provides an alternative perspective on the privileges of academic life, but has good political reason to want to believe in the meritocratic principles that underlie its professional rewarding of intellectual ability over inherited privilege. We need a new genre. Representations of the university are not as yet telling stories that accurately reflect the descriptions of our work now and who funds it. To start doing that, they would need to go beyond seeing finance as, in John Lanchester's words, people doing the stupidly risky things they will do with other people's money if given the chance, though they will no doubt want to retain the capacity to say that when it's true. An up-to-date academic novel will need to recognise both the continuing exceptionalism of the university as a place of work and its considerable porousness with public life beyond it. That porousness only grows, I think, in our current cultures, and it is, in the main, a good thing. Any virtues it would want to claim for the university will have to be described with care, not to turn our structural exceptionalism into a claim for moral exceptionalism in our practices, though the novelist might want to make something positive of our ability, even now, to take time over our projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Small. Questions and comments? Got one here at the front.
Thank you, so that I could see you. And my name is David, by the way, David Funter from the University of Navarra in Spain. My question is for Helen Small. Basically, you spoke about the importance of making a case for the humanities, for the teaching of the humanities in universities, and of course, them being financed publicly or privately. And one of the things you mentioned was the future employability of students. And I guess my question is, how do you navigate the risk of perhaps conceding too much to economic rationality in the very arguments you make in defense of the humanities, in the sense that if you make an argument that is basically economic in favor of humanities, for example, future employability, it's possible that you may be reinforcing the prevailing economic rationality, and that you may also mislead people about some of the benefits of humanities teaching and the cultivation of life of the mind and so on. And in the current culture, I just wonder, how do you manage to combine the intrinsic argument for the value of the humanities with the economic argument, and do so without misleading people about the value of humanities?
My answer to that's quite simple, which is I think we've passed the point at which we could afford not to engage and to say. Is it not? Oh, okay. I'll move this one. I'm going to cause disaster with the floor.
Yeah, it should be on.
It should. Is it, if I just project a bit more, is that okay? Right, fine. Thank you. Well, I mean, my view on that is I think we've passed the point institutionally, politically, however you want to put it, where we could afford to say I don't engage. I stand back. The thing that I do is in some sense pure or self-contained. And there is no loss to be made from engaging with the argument on the economic terms when it's required. And if you don't do it, you're absolutely dead politically, I'd have thought. If you're going to try to engage with our departments of education, higher education, business and skills in Britain, and not know what your data is and where your students are going and what they think you've given to them, then you really are going to be limited in your ability to respond to certain kinds of question. It doesn't all have to be the same people who do it. There are different people doing different kinds of work here. So my answer to that is I think we have plural arguments at our disposal, and just to push one kind of argument is almost always going to be to miss out on the complexity of the object in front of us. But one of the most uncomfortable experiences I've had with advocacy for the humanities of being asked to speak at a conference on work in Sheffield a couple of years ago. And the students wanted to know how the humanities were preparing. That was really the brief. They wanted to know how the work they were doing at the university connected with work beyond the university. And the other speaker who stood up with me, who this is my mode of the afternoon, who will be nameless, stood in front of them and said, I'm at the end of my career. I've had a fantastically privileged time. I have a great place in Switzerland where I go skiing in the vacations. You lot are absolutely, his word, buggered. And he left it at that. And it was supposed to be charming, leftist, I'm on the way out. Maybe it was supposed to stimulate them to some kind of response. The atmosphere in the room was appalled. And I still don't know what his response to that was. So I think we do owe it to our students to engage them in the process of answering that question so that they also have multiple answers at their disposal. The one they probably won't want is the one that I'm talking about partly here, which is that the work is remedial and quite low level a lot of the time and necessary.
Yes.
Hello, I'm Sarah. I'm an educationalist, and I have one question for the rest of the now. Thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. So you talked about values, and we were already discussing before, in like for some people here, where do you think, or where do valuable values come from, or where can we derive them from?
Where do valuable whats come from? I'm sorry, there's
Valuable values. So because you were saying there are values,
Yeah.
maybe.
Now, could I just ask you to disambiguate that? Do you mean what is their origin, or do you mean what is their justification?
I guess we were asking about both actually. So where can we get them from? So where do we derive them from, particularly in a very diverse world?
Okay. I suppose there are the two questions, and they have very different answers. And the question about origins is going to be a question that will have an extremely complex and individual history. And by the way, I have a very different conception of the humanities because I don't, unlike C.P. Snow, unlike you, I do not see literary studies as the paradigm of the humanities.
Nor do I.
Well,
Okay, right.
in which case I would point out that a huge amount of work in the humanities is, boringly empirical, and none the worse for it. But the humanities, if you want to know where it comes from, that's an interesting, long question. Justification. Good justification has to be a bit minimalist about the assumptions it makes. If you make extravagant assumptions, the quality of your justifying arguments aren't going to be so impressive. And I suppose the dilemma we have had is that some people would like to pile a lot into the premises, and one says to oneself, well, with premises like that you can get places, but. And other people want to see how minimal they can be. And I'm, I suppose, quite like Nietzschean in this. I think parsimony of assumptions, elegance of assumptions, minimal assumptions are what we find on the whole intellectually impressive. So, it's not that there's one answer to the question about justification, but there are differences in quality. I would say, how far can we get with modest premises, modest assumptions? Now, I'm not going to, as I promised myself I wouldn't, I'm not going to give you a rundown on how I think ethical justification can work with minimal assumptions, but I think it is very useful to think about the difference between minimal and overbearing, overweening assumptions.
Great. Thank you both very much. Question for Professor Small about the misalignment, perhaps, of scholars, conception of their work, students, ideas and purposes while they come to university, and perhaps universities or policymakers think about what universities should be doing in society. I think you're right, there are misalignments there. Do you have thoughts about what we can do to try to find more alignment? Are there ways we think about structuring training of professors, for example, or think about helping shape their conception of work, helping students or parents think about what the purpose of the university is? What will be your sort of recommendations for actually addressing either structurally or perhaps culturally that misalignment?
Can I start with the external description, because that was really the task I set for myself today, so it's more an anthropological or sociological, quasi-sociological description than anything else. I just think the descriptions would be better if they were, as I said in the old phrase, thicker descriptions. So most of us, you know, we've
Nearer the microphone, please.
it is supposed to be on. Okay. Oh, is it moved around? Okay. I can move this forward. Let me start with the okay. All right now? Is that better? Thank you. Technologically challenged. Right. Let me start with from the perspective that I was taking, which is I'm trying to improve or thinking. I'm telling you that I think we need better acts of description that we can accept when they're presented to us by others doing the work of advocacy. And one of the ways in which they could be better actually reflects something that was said this morning about, you know, we've all been students at some point before we were academics. Assuming that most people in this room are academics, some of you are probably still students. Most of us also have administrative responsibilities. It's a significant portion of the task. So one of the things I'm doing at the moment is trying to help derive a workload counting model for this university, which will not be yet another piece of onerous technocracy that will detract from, rather than improve our ability to, you know, to divide the work up fairly and take work out of the system when it's not needed. And you know, 20% of the job is described by our higher administrators as administrative. So getting a description that allows for mobility between them and that respects the different functions of the university rather than sets up the administration as the antagonists in this picture, I think would be helpful for a start. And then how do we pull them together? Is that really what you're asking me? How do we put those people in the same room? I think it probably, you know, it happens anyway. It happens in this university when somebody gives a paper and you look at the audience and you realise that people in the audience are administrators as well as students. They're there because they're interested in the subject. The last thing I would want to do is to produce a kind of training model that requires people to be there. I think the more the institution can remain flexible, allow for things to happen, they're not assessed, and that produce good and you know, flexible, again, conversation, the better. So I'm slightly disinclined to try to, you know, manufacture it.
Yes.
Laura Byron Scott from Oxford Diocese. I'm a curate and also a philosopher. Laura is my doctoral supervisor. I wanted to return to Honora's twofold distinction between, or her twofold way of thinking of this question. On the one hand, philosophical trends, and on the other hand, trends in higher education, and really just make 2 points. Thinking of trends in higher education, one trend which is really deep in higher education and actually our whole education system in the UK is this sort of instrumentalist way of thinking about learning. It's right there in the idea of learning outcomes, which is in primary school curriculum, the idea of a learning outcome that you can prejudge the outcome of learning and measure it. And then values are only there, as you were saying, as these individual sort of almost just things that are glossed as part of the culture of an institution, but are actually not taught in any real way. And so I suppose thinking of that instrumentalist trend on top of the trends that you were speaking of in terms of metrics and accountability, that to me is a deep trend that makes the cultivation of virtue very difficult. And employability, I think, is actually part of that. It is an instrumentalist way of thinking about the value of humanities, the value of learning, the value of the university. And so it's hard for me to see a place for virtue within that dominant trend. Then thinking of philosophical trends, when Honora, you gave your sort of intellectual history and rules, I've always been really struck by Rawls's work on virtue in the theory of justice and how that's often not picked up as a strand of his thinking. And the idea that virtue is something that is formed, we learn to be just through our character formation in childhood, in families, in family life, in schools, dare I say it, in churches, in other institutions that form us before we even get to university. So I'm just wondering about the place of philosophical thinking on institutions like the families, the so-called private sphere, and the relevance of a Rawlsian way of thinking about that.
Yes, Laura, I think it bears thinking, do people learn about those things, which isn't, as it were, intellectual learning about virtues, and I suspect it's in many, many places other than universities. I would be rather appalled if somebody came as a, so to speak, ethical tabula rasa to university. I think to focus a little more, one of our difficulties is probably it's the learning outcomes side again, that we have spent too many years teaching people that there are, for all subjects and all activities, defined right answers and defined winners. And defined winners is, in my view, a rather more dangerous conception. Lots of things do have defined answers, but defined winners, and our problem is, I think, therefore, trying to take a metric view of learning, and particularly perhaps the more social learning. I was struck recently by a book that some of you may have read by the financial journalist Gillian Tett, who is also a social anthropologist, called The Silo Effect. And she looks at 20 institutional contexts in which there were, as it were, rigid barriers. In order to be efficient, we really need to concentrate on the task at hand and not talk to other people. Some of these institutions quite literally destroyed themselves, including major corporations, and I think that this is probably true of many other things. So I would have as one of my hallmarks of what makes a university possibly rather different from a secondary school is that people do talk with people who are doing something different, and it is ultimately the basis of the scientific method that you've got to have check and challenge. And if you don't have check and challenge, then, as it were, you may drift with the tide very nicely, but it isn't good for maturing, it isn't good for ethical learning, and it isn't really good for social learning of any sort. So I look a lot to other features of institutions, and these externally exposed metrics I would tend to see as, yes, a threat, but we're wily and we can get around them.
Chris, thank you. Here's a question for Professor Small. 2 weeks ago, the building next door to us, the Oxford University Student Union Awards for teachers in the university. What is the effect of that on teaching university? Have you seen any? And for Professor O'Neill, Theresa May and the people in the wake of the Manchester bombing said they will not defeat our values. This sets up a narrative of war, and it also sets up a narrative of objectivity. Could you comment, please?
I'd like to go first.
You can. Anyway, you can. You can flip them over.
Look, when somebody says those are not our values, I don't interpret that in a hostile way.
So they will not defeat our values. They use the word defeat.
They will not defeat our values.
Yes.
Well, you have to say encouraging things in dark moments, and you may not find that encouraging, but I expect it is intended to encourage, and I've heard a number of the bereaved say rather similar things. And if your child has been killed in an atrocity like the one in Manchester, one of the things you do want to be reassured is that people don't think, oh, well, that's that, that's the past, it doesn't matter. And I think people do think it matters. I don't myself use the noun value. That's because I teach ethics, and for the reason I said, I think it's a very misleading term that has been debased horribly in the 20th century, so that people talk about values, particularly, by the way, about other people's values, and what they mean is probably no more than their generic attitudes. That's why I use the examples of the things that most of us would think aren't valuable at all, like sadism, or like cheating, or like assassination, for that matter. These are, so I would read behind May's claim there are some very widely shared standards, and we take them seriously. Now, I don't know what the detail of her philosophy is. I know she's a person of faith. I don't know much more. But I think that the problem really is that this vocabulary is too valuable to let people who are sociologizing it get away with it. On the other hand, we can't use it at present. It's been contaminated by people talking about my values, meaning just what I prefer. And I think that's a deep problem, and therefore when I talk about these questions with students and with others, I simply have an embargo on the word value. I'd be perfectly prepared to say the value of a pint of milk is about 50p. That doesn't bother me, because everybody knows it's economic value. But I don't use values when I'm trying to talk seriously about things that matter ethically.
Should I respond to that? Yes, sorry. I think I'm probably under informed about this. You mean this is the student union giving its own prizes to the best teachers as they see it within the institution? Am I right to suspect there's some worry in your articulation of the question, because it seems to be part of a TEF culture in which students might reward things that we would not necessarily think are the best versions of teaching that they are provided with?
I just wondered what your evaluation of that introduction of student evaluation. You mentioned about the difficulties of research criteria edging out teachers. Is it helpful to see the students say the best teachers are these people who are not necessarily the people with a wheelbarrow full of articles?
Could I come in with some thoughts? This isn't new. When I was a graduate student in the US, there was a radio show with the Red Hot Profs. What was interesting is that they were typically, as it were, they had quite the gift of the gab in the lecture hall, and you may say the wrong people get it. On the other hand, when I was in Cambridge and looked at the Pilkington Teaching Awards, and those go back 20 plus years, I didn't feel that this was infra-dig, and I know that colleagues who got Pilkington Awards were very and rightly proud of them. And I don't think recognition for good teaching is a bad thing or a shameful thing. Whether you do it best by, as it were, popularity polls is the question. That's why the Red Hot Prof approach was a bit over the top. But we survived it.
Just one sentence on that. I think America may be slightly different here. I think you can tell me, but I think we've been very late in Britain to correct for the privileging of research in career progression and so forth. So
no. I'm old enough to remember this. We lately privileged research.
Okay.
It's
in the course of my short lifetime.
Many people who taught me 50 years ago didn't publish very much. When I went to work with Jack Rawls, he hadn't written any books. He'd written a couple of articles. He was in middle life, and he hadn't written enough to get your first lectureship in our world. They were rather good articles.
He was a Red Hot professor.
No, he wasn't a Red Hot prof.
He was the modelling video of the screen.
He had a terrible stammer.
Did he? Oh.
But he was an adored teacher.
There you go.
Helen, can I ask you about your talk, because it didn't quite speak to the teaching career that I think I've had. It seems, when I think of what I've been doing for many years, it's fundamental. I'm an economist. I have the privilege of teaching on the PPE degree, which means that immediately my students are engaging with other things as well as economics, which is very good for them. And I also get to talk to my colleagues and we're working collectively with these students. Advantage. But what I feel most proud of having done is teaching these people to think clearly and then defend themselves. And secondly, that economics happens to be a discipline which I and many people went into because of the sense that it was about making public policy better. And many of our students have that ambition in studying it. So they end up at the end of a 3-year degree, a very large number of them, with a sense of self-worth that they can put an argument together that's persuasive about how to do things better. And then a sense of self-confidence they might well get a job which will enable them to do that in life. Now, I realise privileged to be teaching in this environment and students in this way. I have about one student a year like Felix, and I regard it as my job of bashing it out of him. So that by the end of the term, he's just not able to speak to the master like that because he knows it looks like an idiot. And he's experienced with me in our small tutorial groups the experience of looking like an idiot if he ever tries to behave like that. and it seems to, I think that this in some way connects with the idea of virtue that was being talked about in this morning's sessions. This is a virtue. And I would say that it's not just a discipline like my own, which has as an ambition work in public policy. My wife is a writer and read English literature, and she learned the capacity to write well, and has, amongst other things, writes, but is also a writing coach and engages very often in the kind of remedial work that you describe, which she values doing, and which those who she teaches emerge at the other end of with the self-confidence that they didn't have when they began it. So I think a very large part of what we do is that building of self-worth and self-confidence.
Yeah, and I hope you could get from my description of Felix that I'm not only fond of Felix fundamentally, but I'm actually rather fond of the institution that would have the generosity to allow the quite arrogant young man with quite a, for whom his own situation is the priority in that room, they actually gave him space and let the timetable stretch and compensated and gave up their coffee break and, and expanded and, took back the space where they could in later breaks. There's something institutionally quite humane, and I think it's a good thing to protect the bits of the institution that are still allowing us to do that.
I really agree with that, because I think that we've all had generous teachers, and David's clearly been a generous teacher, and I hope lots of us have been generous teachers, but that is where somebody draws the conclusion that it's worth trying and worth engaging and worth engaging with other people, and not in a situation where they're constantly being marked out of 10 or 100 or however many, whatever it is. And so there is something about the way in which we teach and the way in which we engage. Now, the problem for many colleagues, and after we have to remember the humanities is a small fraction of university students in this country, and small and dwindling, but many of them find themselves in situations where they're in very large classes, and the time for conversation shrinks, and that is where, if I have one sort of slightly technological fantasy, and it hasn't happened yet to my knowledge, it is that the combination of the MOOC and paying teaching assistants well might be a better future. Now, merely saying to people, watch the MOOC and you'll get there, we've already shown with the very good MOOCs that Harvard and MIT have produced that it doesn't work, and that you have dropout rates in the 90-some high %. So you've got to have something else. You've got to have the social life. You've got to have the interaction. You've got to have somebody who will talk with students, listen to the ideas when they're quite silly, give them space, as you say. Yeah. And that's the way, I think, that we enable people to come through learning stuff that they understandably find in part rebarbative, and which of us didn't find part of the syllabus rebarbative. But nevertheless, they get there.
Yes, Andrew Cheadle from Liverpool University. Some of the things you said, Helen, were just very similar to what we experience at our university, although we tend to get students whose parents have never been to university, so they're first generation university students. Interestingly, at the applicant days, for the interviews, the parents want to be at the interview. And they want to be there about value for money. Down to that level. what are they going to get for their £9,250 pounds a year? And one of the things that we have said to them is the employment statistics for Liverpool are not great, never have been. And if you get a graduate job, you tend to do well in the area. But mainly, it helps you become a versatile individual. And the parents appreciate this because they were the generation that after Margaret Thatcher had no jobs and struggled to ever get employment again. So they really understand this structure. And what we found is that some of the parents later come on the courses because now they want to go to university. And that's really exciting to see how that can all work together. Very interesting.
The only thing I'd say about parents is that with the open day, I assume you're talking about an open day scenario, I take it. So I'm perfectly happy to see parents come in and be part of the conversation, and as you say, that has benefits for them as well. Comes to admission, we've now had parents asking to be in the room during the interview, as if they had a right as the payer to be there, at which point the only possible answer is your child is an adult, is legally an adult, and if they're not competent to be in the room and enter the conversation with their potential tutors, then this thing doesn't start. You just have to be explicit.
They should go back to school.
Yes, exactly.
The students ask me.
The
parents come as well. So.
Yeah, you say no nicely.
Just on the road, just across.
This is for Professor Small. You've talked about engaging in the conversation in terms of employability, and I suspect that you don't mean simply in, for example, asking the questions of where the data does not actually give us evidence for claims we make, but that you mean engaging with it beyond that. Can you give us some example of some claims that you would make?
Some claims. I was going to ask, can I start with where those conversations are happening, because that might be a useful place to have it. Where I see them happening at the moment is, for example, it's a good example in relation to humanities, because it goes straight to what Honora was saying about a lot of the work we do being empirical. There are a lot of conversations happening, and you're probably much more locked into them than I am, about how we teach quantitative skills. So it used to be the case until relatively recently that you could hope to equip a student with a humanities degree, and if it was literature, history, I'm not sure where philosophy stands in this, you could hope that they would go into, for example, the public service, become civil servants and so forth. It's diminishingly easy for them to do that unless they have a grasp of economics, unless they have some ability to cope with quantitative data and read it analytically, so they'll critically, to know the difference. For example, and Andrew Dilnot is fond of saying, what is the difference between stating rhetorically that the French debt in 1789 stood at X and actually contextualizing that so that it's a meaningful statement. So there are quite serious conversations happening, and they involve universities in the room with representatives of government, but also external funding bodies that that have a more detached relation to the content that we teach, trying to figure out how do we make sure that the breadth of the things that we are teaching is inclusive of that. Does it happen within the degree? Does it happen as a supplement to the degree? But I think there is an increasingly large group of people who feel that we need to be equipping students with the range of skills so that they aren't frightened by empirical evidence and so forth in the way that some university courses might leave them. Is that something you're interested in?
Here's a puzzle I have. Let me share it with you. HESA, the Higher Education Statistics Authority, ran, and maybe they still run, some rather informative statistics about the amount of work that students do. So it was hours per week over and above the course requirement. So you have your set lecture, lab, and tutorial hours, very varied with the courses. And one of the striking things about British students is how very few hours of independent study. Now, of course, if somebody tries to use this as a metric, it will corrupt it instantly. But it was very striking that the average number of hours of independent study per week of full-time students when I last looked was 13. That's not very much. Meanwhile, for example, medics at Cambridge and Imperial, who were the hardest working lot, absolutely driven, did 51 over and above the required lab, lecture and other hours. That's probably quite a hefty working week when you think about it, because they have quite a lot of lab, lecture and tutorial hours. And I think this is one of the things where we should be much more upfront with our students. Do we actually expect them to do some quite hard work? And I think, on the whole, it's very satisfying for people when they do, but I suspect that it's very often slightly short-changed. We talk about going to university as though once you got your body to the place it happened.
Since we're talking about virtue, I think one of the things that has changed hugely in my teaching lifetime thus far is that it's much easier for them to cheat, that the alternatives to going and reading your way through the book and then reading it again and so forth are much more easily available. So being explicit to them about what is involved in concentration on a piece of work that will probably take them this amount of time and so forth is part of what we do now.
I'm conscious that there are one or two more questions, but I'm afraid we're out of time. But I thank you all for a very astute set of observations and questions, but particularly Professor Small and Baroness Soon.